Outside, the snow began to fall again, just like that night years ago. Somewhere far away, his mother sat by her window, listening to one of his recordings. The same melody filled her room, warm and familiar. She closed her eyes, smiled, and whispered, "I can hear you, Eli." And though miles apart, their hearts played the same song. A song born from love, from struggle, from truth. A song that began the day a director laughed and ended with the whole world listening. But he never forgot where it all began. One cold winter evening, Eli and Maria visited their old neighborhood. The streets were the same, narrow, quiet, a little worn. They stopped in front of the diner where Maria used to work. Inside, the smell of coffee and fried food filled the air, just like before. Some of the same workers were still there. When they saw Maria, they smiled in surprise. "It's been years," one said. Then he noticed Eli beside her. "Wait, you're the piano boy, aren't you? The one from the news?" Eli laughed softly. "Maybe," he said, "but I still like your hot chocolate more than fame." Everyone laughed with him. As they walked home, snow began to fall, light and soft. Eli looked up at the sky. "Mama," he said, "do you ever think about that day? The audition?" She smiled. "Every time you play." He nodded. "I think about it too. I think about how scared I was, and how you told me to play with my heart." She squeezed his hand. "You did, Eli. You always have." The next morning, a letter arrived for Eli. It was from a world-famous music school in Vienna. They had heard about his performances and wanted to offer him a full scholarship. It was everything a young pianist could dream of. But Eli hesitated. "I don't want to leave you, Mama," he said. Maria smiled, though her eyes were full of tears. "You have to go," she whispered. "Music took you this far. Don't stop now. Go where it takes you." That night, Eli couldn't sleep. He sat at his piano and began to play. Softly, slowly. The melody was new, yet it carried pieces of every song he had ever played. It was full of love and longing, of goodbyes and beginnings. His mother stood in the doorway, listening quietly. When he finished, she said, "What's that one called?" He looked up and smiled. "Home." Months later, Eli boarded a plane to Vienna with his mother waving from the crowd. He looked out the window as the city faded below. He remembered every street, every sound, every moment that brought him here. The laughter, the silence, the first note that changed everything. In Vienna, he walked through grand halls and played in places where the world's greatest musicians once stood. But no matter how big the audience or how bright the lights, Eli always played the same way, honestly, humbly, like that little boy in denim overalls who only wanted to share what he felt. Years later, when he was grown and his concerts filled entire theaters, people still whispered the same story, about the boy who made the director kneel. Journalists often asked him, "What's the secret to your music?" And he always gave the same answer, "I never play to impress, I play to remember." One evening, after a grand performance, he stood alone in the empty hall. The lights were dim, and the piano gleamed under the stage glow. He sat down and began to play his first melody, the one he had played as a child, the one that made the world stop and listen. As the notes floated through the air, he could almost see his mother standing by the doorway, smiling, her eyes full of pride. He could see the director in his cream-colored suit, smiling instead of laughing this time. And he could feel the little boy he used to be, shy, afraid, but brave enough to play his heart. When the last note faded, he whispered softly to the empty hall, "Thank you." Eli stood and bowed. His eyes found his mother's in the crowd. She wasn't clapping, she was crying, her hand over her mouth, smiling through her tears. For her, that applause wasn't for fame or victory. It was for every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every dream she had kept alive for her son. When Eli left the stage, Miss Clara met him backstage with open arms. "You did it again," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You didn't just play a song, Eli. You gave them a memory." He looked up at her and smiled softly. "It wasn't mine," he said. "It was everyone's." Later that night, as the awards were announced, Eli didn't care about winning. But when they called his name, first prize, Eli Matthews, the crowd cheered once more. He walked to the stage, accepted the small gold trophy, and looked at it quietly. To him, it wasn't gold that mattered. It was the echo of the music still living in the hall. When they returned home, the trophy sat quietly on a shelf beside the old broken keyboard that had started it all. Maria placed her hand on his shoulder and whispered, "You didn't just win tonight, Eli. You reminded everyone what real music feels like." He looked up at her and said softly, "Mama, I think music isn't about being heard. It's about being felt." She smiled, wiping her eyes. "Then you've made the whole world feel." Years passed, but the memory of that night, the competition, the applause, the tears, never faded. The world changed around Eli, but he stayed the same gentle, humble boy who once played on a broken keyboard. He grew taller, his hands stronger, but his heart remained just as soft. He continued to study at the academy under Miss Clara's guidance. She became more than just a teacher to him. She was like family. Every time he learned something new, he thanked her not with words, but with music. Whenever he played, she would close her eyes and smile, thinking, "This is what real art sounds like, pure and alive." Mr. Harris, the director, became his biggest supporter. He often said to others, "Eli reminded me that music is not about perfection. It's about truth." The academy changed because of that lesson. The walls that once echoed with competition now filled with emotion. Students began to play differently, not for applause, but to connect, to tell stories through sound. Eli performed in many concerts after that, but no matter how big the hall or how famous the crowd, he never lost his calm. Before every performance, he would take a deep breath, close his eyes, and imagine his little apartment, the broken keyboard, his mother smiling by the stove, and the sound of rain tapping the window. Then when he played, the world disappeared. One evening, Miss Clara told him, "Eli, the national music competition is coming. You should join." Eli hesitated. "But that's for real pianists," he said. She chuckled softly. "And what are you?" He shrugged. "Just a boy who loves the piano." She leaned closer and said, "That's exactly what makes you real." Maria wasn't sure at first. She didn't care about trophies or titles. "You don't have to prove anything," she told him. "You've already done more than enough." But Eli shook his head gently. "It's not about winning, Mama. I just want to play one more time. Maybe someone who needs to hear it will be there." And so, they agreed. The night of the competition came like a storm. Bright lights, cameras, an audience of hundreds. The grand hall was filled with the best young pianists in the country, each dressed perfectly, their families proud and confident. Eli, as always, wore simple clothes, no fancy suit, no shiny shoes, just his quiet self and a calm heart. When his turn came, the announcer said, "Next performer, Eli Matthews." There was polite applause. Some in the audience whispered, recognizing the name. Others said, "That's the boy from the video." A few smiled knowingly, while others looked skeptical, but Eli didn't hear any of it. As he walked to the piano, he only saw his mother sitting in the front row, her hands folded, her eyes full of love. He sat down. The stage lights warmed his face. He placed his small hands on the keys and took a deep breath. The first note echoed softly through the hall. Then another followed, and another, until the melody unfolded like a storybook. It was tender and alive, as if each sound carried a memory. He played about everything he knew. The nights when his mother worked late, the mornings he practiced on his broken keyboard, the day the director laughed, the moment the hall turned silent, and the time he saw someone kneel for the beauty of music. Every moment of his life became a note, every emotion a chord. The audience grew completely still. Some leaned forward, afraid to even breathe. A woman in the front wiped her tears. A little girl whispered, "He's making the piano talk." The director, Mr. Harris, was sitting among the judges that night. He didn't blink once during the performance. Each note felt like a letter written straight to his heart. He could feel his throat tighten and his chest ache with emotion. As the final note faded into silence, Eli lifted his fingers and let them rest on his lap. For a moment, the entire hall seemed frozen in time. The sound of the piano still floated in the air like a whisper that refused to fade. Then it happened. Applause, loud and endless. People stood up from their seats, clapping, cheering, shouting his name. The entire hall was on its feet. Eli looked around, surprised. He hadn't expected this. His face turned red, and he smiled shyly. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw something that made him stop. The director had risen slowly from his chair, tears in his eyes again, clapping with trembling hands. The other judges stood too, following his lead. It wasn't just applause for skill. It was respect, awe, and something more. It was the sound of hearts touched by truth. Then it happened. Applause, loud and endless. People stood up from their seats, clapping, cheering, shouting his name. The entire hall was on its feet. Eli looked around, surprised. He hadn't expected this. His face turned red, and he smiled shyly. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw something that made him stop. The director had risen slowly from his chair, tears in his eyes again, clapping with trembling hands. The other judges stood too, following his lead. It wasn't just applause for skill. It was respect, awe, and something more. It was the sound of hearts touched by truth. Broken keyboard, the laughter, the kindness, the love of his mother. Mr. Harris closed his eyes, and as the music washed over him, he saw memories. His wife laughing, the old days when music filled his home, the way he used to love playing without fear of mistakes. When Eli finished, silence filled the room again. Mr. Harris wiped a tear from his eye. He stood, walked up to the boy, and said quietly, "Eli, I made a promise that day, remember? I said I'd kneel if you could play." Eli nodded slowly, smiling. "You already did." Mr. Harris shook his head. "No, son. I knelt because I was shocked. This time I kneel because I'm grateful." And right there, in the empty hall, the director, the man who once laughed at a boy in overalls, knelt again. But this time, it wasn't out of guilt or pride. It was out of respect. Eli didn't know what to do. He quickly stood and said softly, "Please don't kneel, sir." Mr. Harris looked up, smiling through his tears. "Then keep playing," he said. "As long as you play, I'll keep listening." When Eli left that evening, he turned back one last time. The lights from the piano shimmered across the floor, and he thought about how strange life was, how one small moment of courage could change everything. As he walked home with his mother, he said quietly, "Mama, do you think music can change people?" She smiled and squeezed his hand. "It already did," she whispered. "It changed him, and it changed you." Eli looked up at the stars and smiled. Somewhere deep inside, he understood something new. That music wasn't just sound. It was a bridge between hearts, between sadness and hope, between laughter and tears. And from that night on, he didn't just play for himself or his mother. He played for everyone who had forgotten how to feel. The following months passed like a dream. Eli's name was now known beyond the city. Small newspapers in other towns wrote about him, calling him the boy who made music cry. Videos of his performances spread everywhere. Some people said he was a prodigy, others said he was a miracle. But Eli didn't think about any of that. He still lived the same way, going to school, helping his mother, and spending hours at the piano, lost in the world only he could hear. Sometimes reporters came to their apartment. They wanted pictures of the small room, the old photos, the little table by the window. One of them asked, "Eli, what goes through your mind when you play?" He answered quietly, "My life. I play what I remember." Another asked, "What's your dream now?" He smiled and said, "Just to keep playing. That's enough." But behind his soft voice and shy smile, something deeper had started to grow. Each time he played, his music carried more emotion, happiness, sadness, hope, and a kind of longing that made listeners cry without knowing why. Nothing really felt different. Every morning, he still woke up to the smell of his mother's coffee and the soft hum of city buses outside their window. He still practiced on his piano, sometimes before sunrise, with the same quiet passion he always had. But for others, things were changing. The director, Mr. Harris, couldn't stop thinking about that night. The moment Eli played, something inside him had cracked open, something he didn't even know he had lost. For years, he had judged music by technique, speed, and perfection. He had looked for talent in polished performances and flawless fingers. But Eli had reminded him that real music wasn't about perfection. It was about truth. One morning, he walked into the empty academy hall before anyone arrived. The grand piano sat there in silence, its black surface reflecting the soft sunlight from the windows. He sat down and pressed one key. The sound was pure, but his hands trembled. He hadn't played in years, not since his wife passed away. She had been a pianist too, the one who had taught him to love music in the first place. After she died, he buried that part of himself under his work. But now, as he sat there, he thought of Eli. The boy's music had reopened a door inside him. He began to play, slowly, softly. The notes were shaky, imperfect, but honest. For the first time in years, he felt alive. At that moment, Miss Clara entered quietly. She stood at the door listening. When he finished, she smiled. "You're playing again," she said gently. Mr. Harris looked up, slightly embarrassed. "That boy," he said, his voice rough. "He reminded me what music really means." Miss Clara nodded. "He reminded all of us." Later that week, Mr. Harris invited Eli and his mother to his office. The room was filled with certificates, trophies, and photos from old concerts. But one picture stood out. A younger Mr. Harris sitting at a piano with a woman beside him, smiling. Eli looked at it curiously. "She was my wife," the director said softly. "She was a musician too. She taught me that every song should come from the heart. I forgot that for a long time." Eli listened quietly. He didn't know what to say, but he felt something in the man's voice, a kind of sadness mixed with peace. "You reminded me," Mr. Harris continued, "of what it means to truly listen. You made me feel music again." Eli smiled shyly. "I just played what I felt." Mr. Harris chuckled softly. "Yes, and that's what makes it so powerful." He turned to Maria. "Your son isn't just talented. He's special. There's something pure in him. Something the world needs to hear." Maria looked down, her voice soft. "He's just a boy who loves the piano." Mr. Harris nodded. "And that's exactly why his music is so beautiful." From that day on, he took a personal interest in Eli's growth. He attended his lessons, arranged small recitals for him, and even invited other musicians to listen. Some were astonished, some skeptical, but all were moved when they heard him play. Eli, however, remained humble. When people praised him, he simply said, "I just play how I feel." When they asked how he learned so quickly, he said, "I listen." One evening, as the sun set over the academy, Mr. Harris asked Eli to play one more time in the big hall, just for him. The chairs were empty, the lights dim. Eli sat at the same piano where he had once been laughed at, and once again, he placed his hands on the keys. He began to play softly, a melody that felt familiar yet new. It started like a whisper, then grew warmer, deeper. The notes carried the weight of everything he'd experienced. The The next evening, the concert hall was shining with golden lights. Guests arrived in expensive clothes, photographers took pictures, and musicians tuned their instruments. When Eli entered backstage, he felt small again, like the day of the audition. But this time, he carried something stronger than fear. Purpose. Miss Clara knelt in front of him before he went on stage. "Don't think about the audience," she said softly. "Think about your mother. Think about your story. Let them hear it through your hands." When his name was announced, the applause began before he even stepped out. He walked slowly to the piano, the lights warm on his face. For a moment, the world seemed too big, too bright. But then he saw her, his mother, sitting in the front row, smiling with tears in her eyes. He sat down, took a deep breath, and placed his fingers on the keys. The first note was soft, like a whisper. Then another followed, and another, until the hall was filled with a melody that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Every note was a piece of his life, the nights he watched his mother sleep after long shifts, the mornings he dreamed of pianos he couldn't afford, and the moment he saw the director kneel. The music grew stronger, fuller, alive. People in the audience leaned forward, holding their breath. It wasn't just sound, it was storytelling without words. Eli's small shoulders moved with every rise and fall of the song. His fingers flew, but there was no rush, only emotion. By the time he reached the last note, the audience was completely silent. The echo of his music lingered in the air, soft and golden, as if time had stopped. Then came the applause, loud, long, and full of feeling. People stood up, clapping and cheering, some with tears running down their faces. Eli stood slowly, looking out at the crowd. He didn't smile widely or wave. He simply bowed deeply, high, his heart full. And when he looked up, he saw something that made his chest tighten. The director, once again, standing with tears in his eyes, clapping harder than anyone else. Backstage, after the concert, Miss Clara hugged him tightly. "You did it," she whispered. "You didn't just play. You spoke to their souls." Eli smiled shyly. "I just played what I felt," he said again. When he went home that night, Maria was waiting at the door. She didn't say anything. She just hugged him for a long time. "I heard your music," she whispered softly, and for a moment, it felt like the whole world stopped to listen to my little boy. Eli smiled, resting his head against her shoulder. "It's our song, Mama," he said. "I just shared it." After the concert, Eli's name spread faster than anyone expected. Newspapers called him the Miracle Boy, and magazines wrote about the child who plays from the soul. But to Eli, alive, he turned to his mother and said softly, "It sounds like home." Maria hugged him tightly. "It is home," she whispered. That night, Eli played until the neighbors fell asleep and the moonlight faded. He didn't know that across the city, in a quiet office, the director was listening to a recording of that same audition again, the one where he had laughed and then cried. He sat there alone, smiling sadly, and said to himself, "That boy taught me something no academy ever could." As days passed, Eli became more confident. He played not just with his fingers, but with his soul. Every time he sat at a piano, people stopped to listen. And even though he was now known as the Miracle Boy, he never forgot the small apartment, the broken keyboard, and the tired smile of the woman who had believed in him before anyone else. He didn't play for fame. He didn't play for trophies. He played because it was the only way he knew how to speak to the world, honestly, beautifully, and without fear. Every morning, the music academy filled with the sounds of practice, scales, exercises, and pieces that echoed through the halls. But when Eli sat down to play, everything else seemed to fade away. His music didn't sound like anyone else's. It wasn't perfect or polished, but it made people stop, listen, and feel something deep inside. Miss Clara often sat quietly while he played, her eyes glistening. She would think, how can someone so young carry so much emotion? It was as if his small hands knew the language of the heart better than any trained pianist. One day during class, she asked him softly, "Eli, when you play, what do you think about?" He paused, pressing his fingers gently on the keys. "I think about my mom," he said, "and the nights when I couldn't sleep because I missed her. I think about the sound of rain on our window and how I used to imagine it was music." Miss Clara smiled sadly. "That's why your music feels alive," she said. "It comes from real memories." Eli looked up. "Isn't that how everyone plays?" She shook her head. "No, Eli. Most people play what they're told, but you play what you've lived." Word of Eli's gift spread quickly. One afternoon, a reporter came to the academy to write a story about the boy who played from the heart. Cameras followed him as he practiced, but he didn't like the attention. "They keep asking me the same question," he told Miss Clara. "They ask how I do it, but I don't know. I just play what I feel." At home, Maria was busier than ever. People kept calling her, journalists, music teachers, even sponsors. She was proud, but also worried. She didn't want fame to change her son. Every night when Eli came home, she would still make him warm milk and sit beside him while he played on his new piano. Sometimes she'd close her eyes and imagine that same music filling all the lonely nights she had worked through for years. But fame always brings attention, and attention brings pressure. Soon, Eli was invited to perform at a big concert, his first real stage performance since the audition. The event was going to be huge, hundreds of guests, bright lights, cameras, and famous musicians. The director personally called Maria and said, "He deserves to be seen by the world." The night before the concert, Eli couldn't sleep. He sat on his bed, staring at his small hands. "What if I forget?" he asked quietly. "What if I play wrong?" Maria sat beside him and took his hands in hers. "Then you play wrong," she said gently. "But you never stop playing. Remember, Eli, you're not here to impress them. You're here to make them feel." Eli nodded slowly. Her words settled into his heart like a lullaby. Sometimes, when the lesson ended, Miss Clara would sit back and let him play freely. The melodies that came out were not from any composer's book. They were stories, soft, warm, and sometimes sad. Each song felt like a memory being told without words. One afternoon, as Eli played, the director quietly entered the room. He stood near the door listening. The boy didn't notice him at first. His small hands moved gracefully, his eyes closed. The music filled the room like sunlight. When the last note faded, Eli looked up and saw the director standing there. "I didn't mean to interrupt," the director said softly. "That was beautiful." Eli smiled politely. "Thank you, sir." The director hesitated for a moment, then said, "Eli, do you remember what I said that day, before you played?" Eli nodded slowly. "You said you'd kneel." The man sighed. "Yes, and I did. But I also said something else. Something unkind. I want you to know that I've never been more wrong in my life." Eli looked down at the piano keys. "It's okay," he said gently. "If you didn't say that, maybe I wouldn't have played the same way." The director blinked, surprised. "You're not angry?" Eli shook his head. "No, music forgives everyone." After that day, the director often stopped by during Eli's lessons. He didn't speak much, but he always stayed until the end. Sometimes he even closed his eyes as Eli played, as if trying to remember something he had lost long ago. Outside the academy, people began talking about the boy pianist. A short video from his audition had been recorded by someone and posted online. It spread quickly. Strangers from all over the city, even from other countries, began sharing it. They called him the boy who made the director kneel. Maria didn't even know about the video until someone at the diner showed her. She watched it on a coworker's phone, covering her mouth in disbelief. There was her son, her little Eli, sitting at that big piano, playing like an angel, and at the end, the proud director kneeling. Her eyes filled with tears, but her smile was the brightest it had ever been. "That's my boy," she whispered. Life slowly began to change for them. Letters arrived at their apartment, people offering scholarships, piano companies wanting to donate instruments, even reporters asking for interviews. But Maria kept most of it away from Eli. She wanted him to stay the same, the quiet, humble boy who loved music more than attention. One evening, when Eli came home from class, he found something new in the living room. A piano, a real one. Not a shiny concert piano, but a beautiful upright one, polished and perfect. A letter lay on top of it. He opened it and read, "To Eli, from someone who believes in music again, the director." Eli touched the piano's keys, one by one, with trembling fingers. Each note was warm, and Maria's heart skipped. "An apology?" she asked carefully. "Yes," he replied. "I misjudged him. I misjudged everything. The academy would be honored to offer Eli a full scholarship, lessons, mentoring, everything he needs." Maria was speechless, her eyes filled with tears. She looked at Eli, who was sitting on the floor, drawing piano keys in his notebook again. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't know what this means." "Oh, I think I do," said the director softly before hanging up. When she told Eli, he didn't jump or shout. He just smiled and said, "Does that mean I can play again?" At the academy, the news of the boy from nowhere spread quickly. Teachers talked about him, and students whispered in the hallways. Some were curious, some jealous, and some inspired. When Eli arrived for his first class, dressed again in his simple clothes, a few students stared at him, whispering, "That's him." The director introduced him to the piano teacher, an older woman with kind eyes. She asked him to play something small, just a scale or a short melody. Eli nodded, placed his hands on the keys, and began. The moment he started, she felt it too. The same raw magic that had silenced the hall. She didn't stop him. She just listened. When he finished, she said quietly, "You don't need me to teach you how to play. You need me to teach you how to share it." Eli smiled shyly again. He didn't understand what she meant, but somehow he felt that he was exactly where he needed to be. And far away in his empty office, the director looked at the empty stage and whispered to himself, "Sometimes it takes a child to remind us why we love music at all." Eli sat at the piano bench again, but this time it was different. The hall was empty except for him, his new teacher, and the quiet sound of his heartbeat. The same grand piano stood before him, tall, glossy, proud, but it no longer felt like a stranger. It felt like an old friend waiting for him to speak again. The teacher, Miss Clara, watched him carefully. She had been teaching for over 30 years. She had seen hundreds of students, rich ones, confident ones, talented ones, but never one like him. When he touched the piano, something changed in the air. "You don't play," she said softly. "You speak through it." Eli blushed and looked down. "I don't know how to read the notes," he admitted quietly. "I only play what I feel." Miss Clara smiled gently. "Then that's where we'll begin," she said. "Music is a language, Eli. You already speak it from your heart. Now, I'll just teach you the letters." Every day, Eli came early to the academy. He was always the first one there, his hair still messy, his notebook tucked under his arm. He sat by the piano, waiting for Miss Clara. She taught him how to read music, but she didn't force him to forget what made him special. "Don't let the paper control you," she often said. "The best music doesn't come from ink. It comes from life." Maria bent down, looked into his eyes, and said, "Don't be afraid. Just play like you do at home." And so, the boy with the broken keyboard walked into a hall full of laughter and expectation, carrying nothing but courage and a tune in his heart, unaware that his music would soon make even the proudest man kneel. The room was still buzzing with whispers long after Eli's performance ended. People couldn't stop talking about the boy who had played like a dream. Some were amazed, some embarrassed for doubting him, and some simply couldn't believe what they had heard. The judges were quiet, still recovering from the moment. The director, who had knelt in front of everyone, now sat silently, his pride replaced by something softer. Respect. Eli stepped off the stage, slowly. His hands were still shaking, not from fear but from the strange rush that came after pouring out everything he had felt. His mother came running to him, tears shining in her eyes. "You did it, my boy," she whispered, holding him tight. "You really did it." He smiled, but he didn't say much. He was still inside the music, his mind replaying the melody that had come from somewhere deep within him. To him, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like breathing. He hadn't played to impress anyone. He had simply told his story through the piano. While Eli and his mother quietly left the hall, the audience kept talking. One man said, "That wasn't normal. I've never heard a child play like that." Another replied, "Maybe he's some kind of genius." And somewhere behind them, one of the other contestants muttered, "It's not fair. He didn't even have music sheets." But even as they spoke, everyone knew something extraordinary had just happened, something that couldn't be explained by practice or lessons. Later that evening, in a small cafe nearby, the director sat alone with a cup of coffee. He kept hearing the boy's music in his head. Each note echoed, haunting and beautiful. He had judged hundreds of performances in his life, but never had one touched him like that. He remembered the way the boy's hands had moved, not perfect, not trained, but full of truth. He had laughed before the performance, but now he felt ashamed. He had been reminded of something he'd forgotten long ago. Music wasn't about skill or fame. It was about feeling. Meanwhile, Eli and his mother were walking home. The city lights shimmered on the wet streets, and the night felt strangely peaceful. Maria held his hand tightly. "Eli," she said softly, "do you know what you did today?" He looked up, confused. "I played," he said simply. She laughed through her tears. "You didn't just play. You made everyone listen. You made them feel what I've always felt when you play at home." Eli looked down at the cracked sidewalk and smiled shyly. "Mama," he said after a pause, "do you think they liked it?" Maria stopped and turned to him. "Liked it? Eli, you made that director kneel," she said, laughing now. "You made grown men cry. Of course they liked it." But Eli didn't seem proud or excited. His voice was calm, almost thoughtful. "I wasn't trying to make them cry. I just wanted them to hear what I hear." That night, back in their tiny apartment, Eli sat by his old broken keyboard again. He pressed one of the few working keys and let it ring softly. It sounded dull compared to the grand piano he had played earlier, but somehow it felt more real, like home. His mother watched him from the doorway, smiling. "You'll have your own piano one day," she said. "A big one." Eli shook his head gently. "This one is fine. It listens to me." The next morning, the phone rang. Maria almost didn't answer it, thinking it was another shift request from the diner. But when she picked up, it was the director. His voice was warm and formal. "Mrs. Matthews," he said, "I owe your son and you an apology." Every evening, after finishing his homework, he'd go to the window and wait. Across the street, an old man named Mr. Peterson taught piano to children from the neighborhood. Eli would sit by the window, watching through the dusty glass as those students practiced scales and songs. He couldn't hear the music clearly, but he watched their fingers carefully, memorizing their movements. When the lights turned off, he'd sit at his own keyboard and repeat everything he had seen. One night, Mr. Peterson caught him. "You there, boy?" he said, leaning over his gate. Eli froze. "You like watching me teach?" the old man asked. Eli nodded nervously. "Come closer." The boy hesitated, but stepped forward. Mr. Peterson studied him for a moment and said, "You've been watching for weeks. What's your name?" "Eli," he whispered. "Eli, do you have a piano?" He shook his head. Only an old keyboard. Some keys don't work. Mr. Peterson smiled faintly. Then you must have a good imagination. That night, Mr. Peterson handed Eli an old music book, its pages yellow and soft at the edges. Take it, he said. You might not be able to play all the notes yet, but you can learn to see them. Eli held the book like a treasure. It wasn't just paper and ink. It was a doorway. He spent hours studying it, tracing his fingers over the notes as if they were letters in a secret language. He didn't know how to read them properly, but he could feel their rhythm, their shape. Slowly, he began to understand. Maria noticed how he stopped going out to play with the other children. She worried sometimes, but when she saw how peaceful he looked while practicing, she couldn't interrupt. She'd quietly place a cup of warm milk beside him and whisper, "Don't forget to sleep, my little musician." One weekend, the diner announced an open mic night. Maria, proud but nervous, told Eli, "You should play something." He hesitated. "But Mama, my keyboard doesn't even sound right." She smiled and said, "Then make it sound right. Music isn't about the instrument, it's about the heart." So he did. That night, under flickering lights, Eli played for the first time in front of people. The sound was rough, imperfect, but it carried a strange beauty. The chatter in the diner stopped. Even the cook peeked out from the kitchen. When he finished, there was silence, and then applause. Maria wiped her tears quietly behind the counter. The next day, one of the customers told her about an audition happening at a famous music academy downtown. "They're looking for young talent," she said. "You should take your boy." Maria laughed nervously. "Those are for rich kids. We don't belong there." But that night, she watched Eli sleep, his hand resting on the old keyboard. She thought about everything he had taught himself, everything he had dreamed, and then she whispered to herself, "Maybe we do belong there." 2 weeks later, she used her small savings to buy a second-hand white shirt and a bus ticket. Eli didn't even know what a real grand piano looked like. When they reached the academy, his eyes widened. Polished floors, chandeliers, and children in suits carrying sheet music. He clutched his mother's hand tighter. Eli didn't look up. His face was calm. His body swayed slightly as his fingers danced across the keys. The notes rose and fell like waves. He didn't have sheet music, but every sound came straight from his heart. Each key told a story. Of his mother's long nights at work, of quiet mornings waiting for her, of dreams too big for a small apartment. The audience was silent. No one whispered. No one moved. Even the children who had laughed earlier watched in awe. Something about the boy's music made time slow down. When the final note faded, the hall stayed still. You could hear the faint hum of the lights and the soft breathing of the crowd. Then, all at once, people began to clap. Slowly at first, then louder and louder, until it became thunder. Eli looked up, surprised. He stood and bowed awkwardly, unsure what to do. And then, as if remembering his own words, the director stood too. His face had changed. The arrogance was gone. He walked toward the piano, his shoes echoing in the hall. Everyone watched, holding their breath. He stopped in front of Eli, looked at him for a long moment, and then, to everyone's shock, he knelt. His voice was low, filled with emotion. "I said I would kneel if you could play," he whispered, "and I meant it." The audience gasped, and then there was another wave of applause, louder, wilder, full of tears and cheers. Eli's mother covered her mouth with her hand, crying silently in the back of the hall. The director stood again and gently placed his hand on Eli's shoulder. "You are not just a student," he said softly. "You are music itself." In that single moment, the boy no one believed in became someone unforgettable. The laughter that had once filled the hall was gone, replaced by something stronger: respect, wonder, and the power of pure, honest talent. That day, Eli didn't just play the piano. He changed the way everyone listened. I lived in a quiet, forgotten corner of the city, the kind of place where streetlights flickered and the nights were filled with the hum of old buses and the barking of stray dogs. His world was small, but to him, it was enough. He lived with his mother, Maria, in a one-room apartment above a grocery store. The walls were cracked and the paint peeled in places, but it smelled of warmth, coffee, soap, and the faint scent of her hair oil that lingered even when she wasn't home. Maria worked at a diner that stayed open all night. She served coffee to tired drivers and wiped tables until her fingers went numb. She always came home when the sun was rising, her face tired but still smiling. She'd softly open the door so as not to wake Eli, but most mornings he was already awake, sitting on the floor with a small notebook and a pencil stub, drawing pianos. Eli had never seen a real piano up close. The only one he had was a broken electronic keyboard he had found behind a dumpster near the diner. Most of the keys didn't even work. Some made strange noises, others stayed silent. But to Eli, it was magic. He would press a working key and close his eyes, imagining the rest of the melody. Where there was silence, his mind filled the gap with sound. He didn't need the full instrument, he could hear the rest in his heart. Sometimes when Maria had a little time before sleeping, she would sit beside him and listen. Her eyes would shine, and she'd say softly, "You play like you're talking to someone." Eli would smile shyly and reply, "Maybe I am." At school, Eli didn't talk much. He wasn't like other kids who bragged about their games or gadgets. When the teacher asked about hobbies, some said football, some said video games. Eli simply said, "I like music." A few kids laughed and asked, "What kind of music can you play on a broken keyboard?" Eli didn't answer. He didn't need to. He knew that what he felt when he played was something none of them could understand. The grand music hall looked like a palace. Its marble floor shone like glass, and tall chandeliers sparkled above everyone's heads. People whispered softly as they waited for the music academy auditions to begin. Parents straightened their children's suits and fixed their hair. Some kids practiced quietly on invisible keyboards, their fingers moving in the air like butterflies. The air smelled of perfume, excitement, and pride. Then among all the well-dressed children, a small boy entered the hall. His name was Eli. He was wearing simple clothes, faded denim overalls, and an old gray t-shirt. His curly hair looked untidy, and his shoes had scratches. The people around him turned to look. Some smiled politely, others whispered behind their hands. "Who is he?" one woman murmured. "He looks like he's in the wrong place." Eli didn't hear them. He was too busy looking around the hall with wide eyes. He had never seen such a big piano before, shiny, black, and beautiful. The grand piano stood in the center of the room like a king waiting to be honored. Eli's heart started beating faster. He felt both nervous and excited. The director of the academy stood near the judges' table. He was a tall man with slick hair, wearing a cream-colored suit and a confident smile. He had been teaching and judging music for years, and he thought he had seen every kind of talent. When he looked at Eli, he chuckled and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "If that boy can play the piano, I'll kneel right here in front of everyone." The people nearby laughed. Even some of the judges smiled. Eli lowered his eyes, pretending not to notice. His mother, standing quietly at the back, felt her face burn with embarrassment. But she didn't say a word. She had told him before they came, "Some people will laugh. Let them. You just play." One by one, the other children performed. The room filled with pieces by Mozart, Chopin, and Beethoven. The air buzzed with perfect notes and practiced confidence. Parents clapped proudly, the director nodded approvingly, and each performance ended with polite applause. Then the assistant called, "Next, Eli Matthews." A silence fell. Everyone turned again to look at the boy in the overalls. He walked slowly to the piano. His small hands trembled as he reached the stool. He sat down carefully and stared at the keys, shiny and bright under the lights. The piano looked so big, almost like a mountain in front of him. From the judges' table, the director leaned back in his chair with an amused look. "This should be interesting," he whispered. The people in the audience smiled, expecting a funny mistake, maybe a few wrong notes before he was politely asked to leave. Eli took a deep breath. He could hear his heart pounding in his ears. For a moment he thought about running away, but then he remembered his mother's tired smile and her words from that morning. Play with your heart, not your hands. So he closed his eyes. His fingers touched the keys, gently, carefully. And then he played. The first note broke the silence like the first drop of rain after a long drought. It was soft, pure, and so full of feeling that the entire hall froze. The laughter disappeared. Even the director stopped smiling. The sound that came from the piano didn't belong to a child. It belonged to someone who had lived, felt pain, and still found beauty in it.